What did the psalmist and Jesus mean by referring to people as gods in Psalm 83 verse 6 and John chapter 10 verses 33 through 36? So that's an interesting question. Here I'm actually going to turn to St. Augustine himself. St. Augustine was giving a commentary on what was going on in these passages, and I quote him now. If men to whom the word of God came were called gods, much more the word of God himself is God. If men by partaking of the word of God were made gods, much more is the word of which they partake God. Now, what does all this say? There's a recognition that as a person approaches the divine, as the person approaches God, there is a change that happens within them. They become greater versions of themselves. As C.S. Lewis once said, if you were to recognize a person that you were encountering would either be something you would strongly, eventually when they die, will eventually become something you would strongly desire to worship, or some horror that you would turn away from. There is this recognition that as we approach God, there is something that changes about us. Push it further. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was this constant dictum, Deus fit homo et homo fiurunt Deus, that God became man so that man might become God. Now, that doesn't mean that we become God. It's not as though we will have our existence be our essence, or our essence be our existence. It's not as though we will become omniscient, omnipotent, as though we will become a separate divine being, because that ultimately is philosophically unjustifiable and untenable. But it does mean that as we approach God, we will bear a closer and closer similarity to who He is. As others of the Church Fathers have pointed out, humanity was made in the image and likeness of God. When we sinned, we lost the likeness, but Christ continues to reestablish that. And so, all this to say, when there's the reference to men being called gods, it's not as though they are little deities, but rather that they are now bearing a resemblance back to the divine.